Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, welcome to our new show, Head to Head. And it is always good to have a new show that brings out quite a few of the things that are important in our lives, and not only for us, but for our children and our children to come. And tonight I'm really happy, and it's a privilege to have with me, Calixte George Jr., whom, as people would know, was part and parcel at the time of government. He served in government. He serves with the National Trust. And in a sense, there are not many like him who are well endowed. And what I mean by that, well endowed in the academic sense. So, Winston, Calix, so nice to have you on board and to ask you a few questions. Welcome, and I know that you would like to say a good evening to the viewers.
Thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you very much for, of course, considering me for your first show, your inaugural show, Head to Head. So certainly, I'm sure it's going to be a wonderful series indeed.
Indeed, indeed. I chose you because I wanted to look at how we can educate our young, especially where, when you think of government and you think of the National Trust, what role the National Trust plays in our lives and the lives of the ones to come.
Yeah, definitely. The National Trust is not unique in the world. Because there are a number of national trusts all around the world, indeed, and they play very critical roles in conservation, in heritage conservation in countries, starting off, of course, in England and Wales and Scotland, but throughout the world. In fact, there is what is known as the International National Trust Organization, representing many countries around the world. But in the St. Lucia's context, the National Trust is a unique entity. And it, in fact, came out of first a movement which started back, I would say, somewhere in the 1950s, where we saw the formation of the St. Lucia Archaeological and Historical Society, which was a purely non-governmental entity, the likes of Brother Canis Collins, headmaster at St. Mary's College, as well as B.H. Easter, former headmaster of St. Mary's College as well, and a number of early players came together to form this society because there was a recognition that there was a lot of history, a lot of rich heritage in St. Lucia. Individuals like Harry Simmons come to mind as well in their early pioneering work, looking at who is the St. Lucian? Is there, because remember, these were colonial days, we were still being defined by whether we were British or French, and depending on where we were, how we were colonized. But is there, in fact, a St. Lucian identity? And what is St. Lucian? What are the aspects within our culture, within our society, within our country that, in fact, we can learn from? And that is how it really started off in that period. You then had major players such as Sir Robert DeVoe, in fact, in very early days, who were also very much active in studying our history, in finding out what was going on in St. Lucia, and effectively rediscovering a lot of things that were, in fact, forgotten about ourselves.
In effect, what you are really telling me, and as you bring all those together, you are now giving me that insight that the National Trust, as it says national, is a nationalistic entity, and consequently, we are all involved.
Totally. And in fact, where it came to a head, so to speak, I think was with the whole development of the whole Rodney Bay area, which was before it was even known as Rodney Bay. It was, in fact, just Groseley Bay.
Yes.
And of course, there was this whole touristic redevelopment of it. And even the name Rodney Bay comes out of that heritage of what occurred there and Pigeon Island. And in fact, there was at one point a plan, as you know, the causeway was built in the 1970s, and the dredging of the marina and all of this mass tourism strategy at the time. And the plan was, in fact, was to take Pigeon Island and put condominiums on it. And there were, thankfully enough, good-minded people who realized, but this is a real national treasure that we have here. It really needs to become a national park that can be enjoyed by everybody.
Except when I go back, looking at it, that what we destroyed, which now is so important, was the mangroves.
And the lessons learned, certainly, because even in constructing the causeway, we ended up killing the flow, the natural flow, into that Grosley Bay, which was one of the richest fisheries in St. Lucia. And of course, we all know the connection between wetlands and the mangroves that you speak for as nurseries for the fish and the sea life that exists. And so we did, in fact, we have to learn from these lessons of the past.
But that is what I want to come to, because as the National Trust, for example, Savannah's Bay, Bay, from what my surveys that I've done, had four sets of mangroves. One especially was a rare mangrove. They called the black mangrove. And, to an extent, instead of we thinking that here, let the National Trust, build this up because it's part and parcel of our national heritage, we think of how we're going to destroy it to an extent for commercial purposes. I cannot see why that is so.
And certainly, I think we have hit a sort of a development conundrum, so to speak. In today's world, in the 1970s, the idea of sustainable development was not really even a catchphrase.
Quite.
We were in a point where there was oil booms and people fighting over oil and OPEC and what have. Today we realize the consequences of development, and you've got to balance out how these things all work. And we've now realized that tourists are not coming to St. Lucia because they want to see high-rise buildings, or because they can get that in New York, they can get that in London. But they really are coming for unique, authentic experience. They want to be able to enjoy nature, but as well, not just the natural heritage of the country, but also the built environment, the built heritage of the country. And the National Trust was really established, as with all other national trusts around the world, to protect two sets of heritage, natural and built heritage. And the natural heritage, of course, we are abundant with in St. Lucia, but we've in fact made great losses over the years. And so you mentioned the Grosley wetland. I mean, we have other wetlands, like as you mentioned in Savannah Bay and Makote in V4, and these are two what are known as Ramsar wetland sites. They're internationally recognized.
But you see, I hate to say that, Calixte, but a lot of people don't understand much about wetlands. They just think it's just water. We have to get rid of that. And they don't realize how important that is to any country. If we're talking about nature, that is essential.
And the thing about development, I mean, when you think about Castries, Castries is essentially built on a mud flat.
Exactly.
At that time, of course, they were reclaiming land out of the sea and clearing wetlands, the same mangrove in the Conway area, all these areas were in fact wetlands. And you can see up to today the challenges that you have in trying to deal with floods and flood mitigation. It's a very costly thing.
Very much so.
Even looking forward, into the future, 2050, and we're talking about sea level rise. Soon enough, Castries may have to have some sort of, like how you have on the Thames River, barrier to
barriers,
keep out. We may have to have a barrier between Latok and VG to handle the tide and flow of water. It's going to be that serious. Castries is going to be a Netherlands type situation. We're going to have to learn from the Dutch, perhaps. And these are very expensive undertakings, no doubt. And the question is, how do you manage and balance these things? Because wetlands, in fact, do have great value in terms of protection from coastal erosion, storm surge. It's, as I said, of course, the fisheries is very critical. If you go and you clear the Makote mangrove
Yes.
and savan,
Yeah.
we're going to pretty much kill the fisheries down in Viewfort. As you know, Viewfort is our largest landing site for
Quite.
fish already.
But we can see, for example, and I hate to put it that way, having lived in that area for a little while, the importance, say, for example, of Marigot Bay because of the mangroves.
Yeah.
It is, there are times when you see the different fish that comes up to breed in that area. You see the different colored crabs, all sorts, and not only that, but when you hear a hurricane, a lot of yachts can go there and be, at least protected. Now, for me, people have not understood that, just as they have not understood coral, the coral that we have, and they are all part and parcel of the same,
But sadly, in as much as Marigot Bay is very picturesque when you look at it,
Yes, quite.
my last Marigot Bay experience was a little bit disturbing, in fact, and that was in the
Really?
evening,
Lord.
and it was actually the stench coming from the water.
Oh my God!
And
yes.
so you see, it's when you have development, and if you're not
Yes.
taking on the necessary steps in terms of dealing with your wastewater, I mean, we have a huge environmental issue with castries,
Yes,
with
indeed.
raw sewage,
Indeed,
which is
indeed,
still
indeed.
not being addressed.
Yes.
But it's not just there. It's along a lot of our coastal areas. Where we
Areas.
do in fact have villages, and the truth be told, if we are honest with visitors coming to the island,
Yes.
we may very well be telling them, don't go in the water.
But
Because
it's a fact.
and that the results are showing that, in fact. So we need to be very clear that development has to be it has to be protected. The environment has to be protected within the context of development. It has to be sustainable, because we are going to suffer as a
Yes,
result
quite.
of that.
There are two things questions, but the first one I want to put to you is, can the National Trust be a business concern? Say, for example, you turn it into a business. What National Trust is a business now. It's not, it's not the country type of thing. It seems as though it's almost just business-wise. Can that be?
Of course, the National Trust can generate revenue, and it does generate revenue.
Correct.
In fact,
yes.
currently, right now, the National Trust, as you know, generates all the revenue
Yes,
it
yes,
requires
indeed,
to fund
indeed.
itself.
Yes.
The National Trusts around the world do just that. The
Yes.
National Trust in England is
Yes.
a multi-million-dollar
Yes.
enterprise. But to be able to do that, I think there has to be a great appreciation within the country for heritage and the value for heritage. You see, that's where it starts. And I think here we need to develop that culture. And it needs to be pervasive. It needs to be in every town and village and
nook and
rural
cranny
area.
of the country.
People need to understand
Yes, quite.
what the value of what they have and how they can repurpose and adapt what they have for current uses and commercial livelihoods as
Therefore,
well.
we need to indoctrinate our children and those to come into the importance of the National Trust, also the Archaeological and Historical Society, which should be, as I mentioned just before we came on, that the two now should come together and form this new thing, with whether it's a National Trust, Archaeological Society group, and I think from there you can work that out as to how they can become a business.
Certainly, but you see, there has to be an appreciation at all levels. Heritage and heritage conservation, especially if you talk about built heritage conservation, does require funding. It requires special incentives to be able to conserve buildings, to conserve these things, and to repurpose them so that they can be used for the future. And I think that is where we have not taken it on as seriously as we should. I'm talking about as a country.
Yes, as a country.
We have not. You see, when you look at Barbados, for instance, and how they preserve, they've got a. I mean, of course, it's a different type of development.
But you only have to go to
they are
Grenada,
along the
Antigua.
colonial period.
You see
and
it.
every exactly. So you have
Grenada's
Nelson's
amazing.
dockyard in
Yes.
Antigua, Grenada,
Yes,
and it's
yes.
St. George's Town.
Yes.
And the appreciation of how they have modeled even what is new after
Correct.
what was there before.
Yes.
Right? So we have to talk about things like architectural conservation zones.
Correct.
Castries, of course, has had a very big loss in 1948 as a
Yes,
result
with
of
the fire.
and
Yes, yes, yes.
1927,
Yes.
earlier fires. But there's still gems that exist that we should be celebrating and we should be looking at and saying, look at this building here, and how should that building and its architectural language speak for the entire streetscape? Can the street learn from this building, which may have a veranda overhanging the sidewalk, which may have a certain character, a mansard roof, whatever the case may be? And that is the kind of development that we want to see. Nobody's coming here to see boxed buildings, quite frankly.
Or glass
Or
buildings.
or even that maybe.
That's
So,
what it's-
I mean, but you see, there's a lovely building in right next to the House of Parliament in the United Kingdom in London.
Yes,
So
yes,
the
quite.
Portcullis House.
Yes, yes, I
And
know,
it's
yeah.
a very, very modern building.
Yes,
But
indeed.
its structure and the way it is designed was reminiscent of what it was before.
Right, indeed.
So you can have
Learn
modern
from the- yes.
buildings, but the language and the architecture need to be, respectful
Yes,
of what is
quite,
there already.
Quite. And even what you have, for example, let us go back here, for example, the Alexander Building,
Sir Donny Alexander's
yes,
house,
exactly.
right opposite the Walcott House on the show.
Correct. And it's
Yeah.
not out of place,
No, totally not.
but it's been somewhat preserved. But we could do better than that, because there's so many others similar.
But we're
that we
losing them
have-
very quickly.
Exactly.
And we're losing them to fire, we're using them to vandalism. Unfortunately, in a lot of these areas, crime is affecting them and people are
But
moving out,
again-
so then these buildings
But again,
get abandoned.
Calixte, it's because we are not educating our young to the importance of those things and how these things can help in our development. Even when we talk about tourism, that can help in that, because the tourists will want to come.
The biggest business of tourism
Yes.
all around the world, when you think about the largest players in tourism, Italy, France, Egypt,
Yes.
the United
Yes.
Kingdom.
Yes.
What are
yes,
people going to see?
Yes.
They're going to see heritage. They're going to enjoy the heritage of the people and the people who lived there for many
Correct.
years. Italy has a Ministry of Antiquities.
Yes.
And
Yes.
a similar thing with Egypt. Now, obviously, people are going to come and say, "Oh, well, we don't have any history to talk about, compare." But we are belittling ourselves.
Yes,
We are
indeed.
putting ourselves down and not sharing what, in fact, we do have, because we do have a rich legacy that needs to be conserved. And that's the whole point. When you look at the work of Derek Walcott
Yes.
and Homeros and what he
Yes.
was trying to say, that
Yes.
here in this Caribbean archipelago, we are no different than the Greeks, than
Yeah.
the Greek archipelago.
Exactly.
And we have a story to share as well.
And our one of our best artists and things that sort, Saint-Omer, whatever he did, if we now can go back and preserve these sorts of paintings and things of that sort, and make that, say, for example, a tourist attraction.
I can tell you when
Yes.
when I bring a visitor to see the cathedral, the Minor Basilica, and people look at the art.
Yes,
And they're
quite.
fascinated. They're amazed
Exactly.
that this is the most interesting church that they've ever been into. So and I mean
Yes.
the Holy Family, a mural at
Yes.
Jack Mill. There's a lot of
Oh, yes.
rich
Oh,
heritage,
yes.
and it shows that here you have a local artist who is inspired by our own, ourselves.
Yes.
In fact, sharing that, and I think that is really where we need to continue along that journey.
The question now I want to ask you is, in what direction now is the National Trust going? Where can it go now? And you being on the board or whatever it is, what are you all talking about in especially in the present situation that we are in, to move the National Trust forward, into that new era, the new light of development.
Yeah, the National Trust has two roles to play. It has a
Yeah.
direct role in terms of properties that it has under its watch, and properties
But are
which
they
it
state
should.
properties?
Well, they are state properties, which are held under trust by the National Trust.
Right.
So
yes.
they've
It's important
vested
that people
they've
understand
vested
that.
into the National Trust.
Yes.
a lot of these properties, in some instances, they're leased,
Yes.
as in the case of Pigeon Island. Pigeon Island is actually in the 99-year lease
Right.
from the Crown. But there are a lot of properties which are actually vested into the National Trust. In fact, most of our land holdings are, in fact, from private donations. Persons who actually donated land to the trust. And this is the same as in the case of England.
Yes, everywhere.
People must donate,
yes.
and they must actually give because people understand that these things will be conserved for perpetuity and for a good purpose, for conservation.
And that's why it must be preserved.
Yes. Now, we don't try to use the word preserve so much as conserve.
Conserve also. But you use both.
So that, in other words, there's still use. There's still
Yes.
use, but it's not necessarily just encapsulated as it is and just left as it is.
Quite.
So certainly there's that role for the National Trust within that respect. But there's a broader national mandate of the Trust to advocate and to look at national development. Because the National Trust, we can never put all the buildings that have to be conserved within the National Trust. There has to be private ownership and private participation in heritage as well. But of course, governmental participation
not
as
cutting
well.
you short, we see this in Fondue.
Of course.
Excellent
example.
Excellent example.
Yes. And there are others out there. I mean, you look at the Howelton House up on Therefore on that road.
But isn't it amazing that a lot of people from overseas want to go to Fondue just to live to stay in these sorts of old houses that have now been preserved, to feel what it was and to feel as though they are back in those years. And a lot of people have not understood that here. And that is why I think programs like this is very important.
But as a caveat to that, though, I just want to point out that in as much as that is good in terms of conservation of some of the buildings, we still also need to look at in situ conservation as being very important. Buildings have a context.
But of course.
So if you take, I don't know, any building that you want to look at right now, maybe the old Anglican school, just for example.
Yes, indeed.
And you say, well, let's put it somewhere else. It may very well lose its context, because the context is that this was where Arthur Lewis and Alan Lewis and all his brothers went to school, and so you have to see how can that building perhaps be conserved, developed. Maybe turn into an interpretation, a museum of the Anglican Church in St. Lucia. And I'm just using that as an example.
No, but I was just going to say how, now you put this the churches that we have, the old churches, how do we preserve this, even in Dennery and places of that sort? How do we keep this alive, even though it is that old? How do we keep it alive so that those to come can see and say, how old is that? It's so important. But that's why Europe is where they are. Even Iceland. You would never think that preserving anything in a place like Iceland is it's such a cold place nearly 7 months of the year.
I think even some of the things that are being done may offend the sensibilities of St. Lucians in terms of how sometimes these buildings are used, because you sometimes even nowadays have churches being turned into nightclubs in the United Kingdom. Obviously, a lot of me want to go that direction. But certainly we have to see how a building can, in fact, I mean, the example of the Powder magazine upon the Mons, for example. I mean, that is one of the old, if not one of the oldest structures in standing buildings in Castries, in St. Lucia, from the 1760s. And it is an amazing structure. Of course, it's very strong because
it's still there
to withstand exposure.
And the only reason why it will decay is because we have allowed it to decay.
But it has to have a use, you see, and otherwise so if you don't find uses for some of these buildings, and if they're not maintained, then unfortunately they're going to end up losing them.
But these are our attractions.
The other thing that
when we talk about tourism, in the sense that we talk about tourism, these are the attractions that we have to try and preserve and look after, conserve, as you said, and things of that sort, and put a little money, because we will make back the money. Definitely. Because the tourists will want to see those things, and not only that, when St. Lucia is advertised, these are the things that we are going to advertise as far as tourism is concerned. And people will want to see it because, in a sense, they won't believe that these things are still there. And they are.
And the other thing about it is that you take a site like you go to anywhere in China, for instance, or
Yes,
Taiwan,
indeed, yes.
and you have a site and it may have been developed.
Yes.
But in the process of developing the site,
Yes.
it has to be studied, it has to be understood.
Correct.
You've got to do some level of research, right? And I think that's where we need to get to the point. This is not just any willy-nilly type of thing. You've got to do your scientific research.
Yes,
You've got to
indeed.
see what it is.
Indeed.
You visit an airport in China or Taiwan,
Yes.
and they'll tell you about the people who lived there before,
Correct.
what was
Correct.
done, and it's a whole story in terms
Correct.
of the interpretation and the whole experience.
Correct.
So wherever you go has a story, and that enriches the experience of whoever is interacting with that space. They get a sense of space. And I think that is sometimes lacking in St. Lucia, a sense of place. It matters so much. Sense of identity, sense of self, and sense of place.
Is it
defines
is it
greatly
because
a
too
person.
that therefore the National Trust has a big role to play in the educational system, and what I mean by that, I believe that
It does, but I don't
Yeah.
think that it would mean that the state itself should
Get involved.
rescind its responsibility, because the state is the one that sets curriculum.
That's-
Friends, we have a huge issue in terms of not teaching history in our schools right now, history and geography. I personally think there should be something at a primary school level heading into secondary school, St. Lucia Studies. And within St. Lucia Studies, we're learning about essentially almost like a history, geography of the
Yes,
country.
quite, but that's what
because people need to know
Yes.
about where they are living and understand who they are.
but it's not even
And-
that.
and we're not doing
Economics
enough of
come
that.
into that.
Yes.
You know, and that's when I was at university. I couldn't believe it, that the history that I once knew at the college was not the history now that I was being taught, because the history, you wanted to know classical history, go and study these old years and dates but when you're talking about modern history took sociology, it took economics, everything came into that, and even things like social psychology. So in a sense, these are the things that the educational system has to understand.
And I'm saying so because sometimes people think, well, the National Trust should do this, the National Trust should do that.
Yes, quite.
The National Trust, the reality is still a fairly small organization, only about 35 employees,
Yeah.
a budget of maybe about $2.5–3 million or thereabouts.
Wow.
Right? The state, however, and the National Trust only has about 0.3% of the land in St. Lucia. We don't have anywhere near what perhaps should be protected, right? Or that's not so, and we know that it can never be that way. But the reality is, the state has to put in place the necessary legislation, the necessary planning legislation that conserves, that protects, that ensures that, in fact, our entire country, the education of the people, that is the responsibility, very much so to a large degree, to the state. It's not that the National Trust should not get involved and is not getting involved, but it certainly has to come from a statewide decision. France, when you talk about French, French only became the national language, really. Everybody started to speak French when Napoleon decided that everybody would to speak French. Because before that, there were different dialects all over France.
No, but here you are. You having said that, you're quite right. Because, people say, well, oh, Dennis Springer brings Taiwan into everything. But at one time in Taiwan, that is why Taiwan never, the people in Taiwan never controlled Taiwan fully, because there were 21 Austronesian tribes, and each spoke a different language. And when Chiang Kai-shek came, he said they must all speak Mandarin. And even in China, they were not speaking, the whole country was not speaking Mandarin. They were speaking different, Cantonese, yes, and Hokkien and things of that sort. But when he came, he said Mandarin, and Mandarin came. But now you could see that they've suddenly realized, and now they've recognized 17 tribes. And let them be part and parcel of this history of Taiwan.
Yeah.
So people come, they see the different dressing, the different costumes that they wore, and people keep it going with their own little language. you know.
I mean, I remember visiting Ancillary Fish Friday once.
Right.
And going on the jetty, and there were some young boys from the village there.
Yes.
And they were asking me for $1.
Yes.
And I asked, well, you know what, I'll give you $1 if you can tell me something about Ancillary
Ancillary.
that I don't know.
Right.
And I think the point I'm making is that
Yes.
people need to know about their country. And
Especially the youth.
And the young, yes, everybody
The young
needs.
people, yes.
And it can then, in fact, be a wonderful opportunity for enterprise, for adding value.
For learning.
But I'm saying that it's not just about purely from an academic
point of view. Yes.
It has value.
Correct.
It has value. And I think we need to understand that what we have has value if we celebrate it.
But why don't we understand that then?
Because I think it's how we've been cultured. It's or not cultured. Sometimes I think we really got the worst part of. And when you look at the awakenness of people in Barbados and Martinique, sometimes I think to myself, why is it that in our instance we're not fighting some of these battles? And I think it is that it's an education issue. I think it needs to be grounded in your education system. Right, that you have to know, and it's everywhere around the world. British history, the English teach British history, the Americans teach American history.
Yes.
But for us, we teach Caribbean history sometimes to a few, and the numbers are falling in terms of how many people are doing CXC history. But when you look at even the examples of, well, how are we teaching slavery? In St. Lucia, where we're not bringing people to see it. We don't have a slavery museum. We don't have a slave burial ground to bring them to.
Yes.
But these things need to be in place. And these things take deliberate decisions to make those investments because it costs money. It costs money to do it.
But as always, things change. And therefore, this applies to the trust. So, in my view, what sort of changes then that the trust needs to bring on board, for all these things to happen, to make the trust now a spotlight in every child's mind?
The trust needs to definitely do a lot more advocacy and education work.
Correct.
There's no doubt about it. And there's still this belief or impression among some that this is sort of an elitist type of entity. It's mostly expats who are interested in it. Strangely enough, national trust.
Yes.
And it's something for the people up north. It certainly has to get itself into the communities, community by community. It needs to embrace communications a lot more. I think it needs to embrace the media.
So it has to play a vital role in our society, a vital role, a pivotal role in effect. The trust now must become that. And as you say, it's not the elitists. It is for everyone.
But it's a challenge across heritage conservation organizations, however. I think all heritage conservation organizations on island are at risk. In as much as that the trust is the strongest one of them, of all, I would say.
Quite.
But when you look at the others, the Folk Research Center, we know the situation with them right now, and the loss of their buildings, the Archaeological and Historical Society needs strengthening. I'm sure if you speak with Mrs. Margot Thomas, she tries very, very hard with very, very little with the National Archives. But you see, and when I say at risk, we're talking about actual physical things are at risk.
But when you say the National Trust, can't we have another name where all of those come under one national entity?
I think there is a need to push for a greater cooperation. Amongst a lot of these entities. I think we may never get to a point where it is all in one. That could be the possible outcome, but I'm not sure necessarily that it may necessarily be the most functional thing either. But I do think that there needs to be a greater level of streamlining of certain responsibilities.
Don't you think that if we don't come under one national thing, we will have the them and us?
Well, no, certainly we have to have a national approach. And I think there needs to be a national heritage strategy. National heritage policy and national heritage strategy. And that would be how you would say, well, what is the Folk Research Center maybe going to focus on, for instance? What is the National Trust going to focus on? Right now, for instance,
more
we
unification.
don't really have a museums authority in St. Lucia. So you find that this is
Exactly.
a big. This is the only country
That is
in the
right.
Caribbean that doesn't have
Yes.
a museum.
Can you imagine that?
Right, a proper
A
national
proper national museum.
and,
Everywhere you go, you find it.
I think the possibilities to really in a country like St. Lucia, which is with our rich heritage,
Exactly.
to have even more than just
Exactly.
one national
Exactly.
museum.
So it's programs like these, more programs to educate our young and for them themselves to force that upon governments. I hate to say that and say that's a necessity. It is looking, from our past to our future.
Yes, I mean certainly, and I think young people when they go away,
Exactly.
they get excited about these
Yes.
things. I mean, you're hearing people right now talking about the fact when they go away, they go to prison museums.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
They go to
Correct.
sites. I was very privileged to visit a concentration camp
Oh,
site
yes.
back at Bergen-Belsen
Yes, I know. I know.
in Germany, in Hanover,
Yes,
near
I know,
Hanover.
I know.
And you see these sites and you see
Yes.
the Jewish heritage
Yes.
and the difficult heritage it's called, really.
Quite.
Right? We have a difficult heritage here in St. Lucia
Yes.
that we haven't dealt with, slavery.
Yes, quite.
And we try as much as possible sometimes to just
Yes.
sweep it away and this is this
Yes.
is in the past. It's not that many generations away when
That's
you think
true.
about
That's
it.
true.
So we need to come to terms with a lot of ourselves, really.
Yes, quite.
And I think that is so. A lot of young people out there, thanks to the internet technology, they're learning about a lot of other places and a lot of culture out there and history, heritage out there. I think now is the time to certainly reinforce our own heritage agenda.
So therefore, it should be a wholesome thing, and when we talk about that, we even have to bring in, I hate now to hit that, to bring in even marine conservation and things of that sort. One holistic thing that tells us that is what St. Lucia is all about. And when people are saying that they go to, say, for example, to Paris for the COP21 and things of that sort, we go there, but we bring nothing back, because in a sense, those who go don't understand it. And the problem is now, St. Lucia now has to, begin to think that way if we are to preserve what we have and conserve what we have.
I mean, Dennis, we only have 152,000 acres.
Yes,
in
quite.
St. Lucia.
Exactly.
We have more people than we have acres.
Yeah, I know.
And that our island needs to provide for us food. It needs to provide for us water, clean space,
Yes.
recreation, places for work, employment. All of that has to fit in there. But it's a small island.
Yes.
And it really need to take the time down to do proper planning. I think that's where the problem is.
Planning.
All right.
Yes.
Figure out the various layers that
Correct,
exist in our country, and plan accordingly. Right. And we also need to wake up to the realization that the 1960s, 1970s model of development has changed.
So therefore, and the idea too is this idea that I always believe very firmly in is engagement, engaging people, engaging, all the different entities to come together, listen in the decision-making process, whether it's government or not. It's so nice talking to you, but we're coming towards the end. How do you see now, your vision for the National Trust?
I would really hope that in 10, 15 years, the National Trust would be a fully autonomous entity.
Yes, quite.
It would have achieved in St. Lucia a mindset of conservation and sustainable development. People would be a lot more aware of the impact that they are having on the environment. They'd be a lot more appreciative of themselves. They would have a sense of identity. They would have a sense of self. They would be able to enjoy their country. And that's another very critical aspect of it. The enjoyment of beaches, the enjoyment of the rainforest, the enjoyment of walking through a streetscape perhaps, which is covered with lovely buildings,
Completely relaxed.
Relaxed environment,
Yes, yes.
A development that respects our realities
Yes.
in where we live as a small island developing state. I would really hope that the National Trust would be the vanguard of that movement, as well as a steward for conservation protection of a lot of gems that we have in St. Lucia.
Calixte, honestly, thanks very much for coming. I hope that tonight, with this first program of Head to Head, that at least we have educate some of the people who listen. I hope it will be all St. Lucians, because we need to really conserve and preserve and to look after what God has given us, in a sense, and to make this country this St. Lucia that we would like it to be, a country where everyone is one and happy.
We've got to conserve it for ourselves first, and then be able to share it to the rest of the world.
Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Calixte, for coming. I enjoyed that immensely.
Thank you
I
very
wish we
much.
could have continued.
Indeed.